Yeah, they're probably
A lot more.
Yeah.
So much more.
Yeah, you'll get flagged for Googling that.
Yeah,
But-
get a little visit from the Secret Service.
It would still won't be worse than the week that my entire search history was looked up into Nazis.
I don't know anything.
Oh boy.
No, like I'm so convinced still that from working on Hellboy, like I have an FBI file. Also,
Yeah. That's not going to be
We're going to start in 1 minute, so now is the time.
sucking voices
Silencing
directly
cell
into the
phones
microphone.
that don't work anyway, but I still have to say it.
they sort of work in here.
Do they?
This room gets better reception than
Even
most.
though your cell phone works a little bit in here.
Jesus. No pressure.
It's okay.
It's right there.
All you should do is
Yeah, let's
incredibly
go 4 minutes.
insightful, nuanced, thoughtful.
Yeah, don't stutter, don't pause too much, don't say too much.
Because you'll hear every like when they play it back. Every one. You know it.
No, I'll do the thing while I get caught in the vortex where I'll realize I'm doing it.
Yes.
Like this happens quite a bit when I have to do any sort of broadcasting or whatever. Is I'll realize the thought is stalling out, and then I'll focus on the fact that I have a stalled
And
out
that's when
thought,
time becomes a loop.
and then I realize how much time it's taking, and everything just I just freeze.
Thanks everybody for coming. Appreciate you being here. My name is Janelle Asselin. I'm here from FlipON.TV. We are going to be talking today about harassment in the comics and comic culture. It's one of those things that's uncomfortable, hard to talk about, and needs to be talked about. So we've got a great panel of guests here. I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
I'm Rachel Edidin. I'm a writer and editor. For the last 7 or so years, I've been advocating pretty consistently for policy-driven anti-harassment resources and covering a lot of harassment and gender issues in the comics and video games and larger geek community.
My name is Bobby Roberts. I'm a writer, mostly focused on the pop culture side of things for the Portland Mercury.
My name is Laura Hudson. I'm a writer primarily at Wired. I write about entertainment and culture, but also issues of gender, like harassment.
I'm Janelle Asselin. I'm an editor and writer, and I also often write about feminist issues.
I want to start with the most obvious question, because I think it's the simplest question and the hardest question, is what is harassment?
Ooh, I've got this one. And I'm going to read straight out of the Emerald City Comic Con program, the first page of it, which has their harassment policy, which includes a really good definition. So harassment includes offensive verbal comments related to race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, appearance, body size, and religions, sexual images in public spaces, deliberate intimidation, stalking, following, harassing photography or recording, sustained disruption of talks or other events, inappropriate physical contact, and unwelcome sexual attention.
That seems pretty good. And panel over. No.
Yes.
Now that we've identified it, it's something that we know happens. It happens in cons, it happens online, it happens at comic book stores, and it's scary, and it's something we don't always know how to identify it and what to do about it. And in those first moments of you're feeling uncomfortable, you're pretty sure what just happened is wrong, but you're not sure what you should do about it and if you're in a safe space to do about it, there's a lot of decision making that needs to happen real fast. And just that thought process of how to deal with those situations.
I mean, I think that there's an impulse for a lot of women in particular to dismiss what's happened, to convince yourself that it really wasn't that big of a deal. And when I've talked to women where things have happened, sometimes that's their almost reflex response. They were like, this happened, but it wasn't a big deal, or it's fine. And you're like, but is it really fine? Or are you just saying that because you feel you need to smooth this moment over? And giving yourself permission to be uncomfortable and to tell other people that you're uncomfortable, I think, is part of it, that it's okay to do that.
Well, I think there's a lot of shame wrapped around it can be really hard to speak up when something bad is happening and say, hey, no, maybe you don't grab my ass on this convention floor. It can be really intimidating to say that, and then you feel shame because you haven't spoken up, and that sort of becomes self-defeating.
Mm-hmm. And it becomes this thing where if you feel like, well, if I didn't speak up that time, then if something happens again, it's got to be a lot worse to justify speaking up, because I've already, set that this is the bar that I'll tolerate, and that's something that I think ends up reinforced deliberately or not by a lot of the discussion around harassment, because one of the things that kind of threw me when I first was starting to talk about it, talk about it and read about it, and I come from a background doing assault advocacy and working with survivors of sexual violence, and something that's come up a lot is that conversations around them can be really, really good for support and for points of identification, but they can also sometimes normalize abuse and harassment and normalize those experiences. And I mean, I remember having a lot of, having creepy shit happen at conventions and thinking, well, this isn't so bad. I know so many people who have had so much worse happen, and, I've never had someone actually just like come up to me and grab my ass at a show. So, getting cornered and having a random person put their hand on my waist when I was working at the booth, like, it wasn't that overtly sexual, and it can't have been that big a deal, because, stuff gets so much worse.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit before about unwanted touching and the place of cultural norms in that.
Yeah.
As cultural norms are sort of the contextual things that, we may not think about them or say them out loud, but they're basically the things that we think are okay. And touching women is surprisingly like a cultural norm that's a lot more acceptable than touching men.
Yeah.
Like, I've definitely had a lot of experiences, and there are times when it doesn't bother me, but I've definitely had strangers touch me in situations where I think they wouldn't do this with men. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's more of a sense with women that there's an innate permission to do that. And I think that interrogating ourselves about that, like both as women and as men, is important to do. Like, why do I feel like I can touch this person? Or why do I feel like this person can touch me? And if I feel uncomfortable about that, like, is that me? Am I the problem here? And I think people are hesitant to speak up because it is a cultural norm. And then, in a sense, that they feel that they're violating that by saying anything. Well, everybody, it was just someone grabbing my waist in the booth. Is that really something that I want to make a big deal out of? Mm-hmm. Everyone else seemed to think it was a normal thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think, but again, like, I think recognizing that it shouldn't necessarily be a normal thing to think that you can walk up to a woman that you don't know and just touch her. Ask yourself if you would do that if it were a man. I think a lot of the times the answer is no.
I think at cons there's another factor too. I've heard a lot of unwanted touching stories specifically and across gender lines from creators and from people working at cons. And I think that the economy of conventions specifically leads to the assumption that there are people who are there as public commodities. That's something that I've heard from folks who've and seen and experienced exhibiting. And I think it also relates really, really heavily to harassment of cosplayers. And the idea that somehow by coming in costume, by coming as someone recognizable, they then somehow implicitly become a public commodity.
And so speaking of cosplayers, and cosplayers definitely get a lot of pictures taken with people. That's part of the fun of dressing up, is sharing it with others. Mm-hmm. And in those moments of being asked for photographs and someone naturally just latches onto you or whatever, even though you gave permission for the photograph, maybe talking about ways to moderate or draw lines about physical contact in those moments, and how to kind of practically manage yourself and your space for people who might not consciously be aware of those boundaries.
I think the onus needs to be on the people who are crossing the lines. I mean, I think cosplayers shouldn't have to do that. I think the lesson isn't, if you're a cosplayer, this is what you should do to protect yourself. I think the lesson is, if you want to touch a cosplayer or anyone else, just ask.
Well, and also ask in a way that makes it okay to say no.
Yeah.
I think there are ways to ask really loaded questions, like, it's fine if I do this, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not really asking. If the person feels okay saying no, if you phrased it in that way, then I think you've done it correctly.
May I is a great start. That's just, it's simple structure, and yeah.
I think it's just a matter of challenging the sort of assumptive permissiveness that a lot of people will just sort of operate on. Like you said, people will come to a convention and assume that anyone who has showed up in a costume is volunteered to essentially be a prop for either your photograph or you know, any advances that you might possibly have. And it's a matter of like Laura said, just sort of challenging that in your own mind and questioning whether or not the behavior you're about to engage in is behavior you would engage in anywhere else. I mean, just because they're wearing a costume does not negate the fact there's still people underneath that have to go home, and you know, right before they go to sleep at night, they're going to remember what happened that day, and it would be nice if the memories flitting behind their eyelids as they're closing weren't gross ones that made them feel sad. And a lot of that's a lot of the problems that we sort of run into when it comes to, you know, a giant group of people who feel like they get to, you know, let loose and cavort and have fun the way they want to have fun, the way they don't get to have fun at their workplace. You know, in general, a lot of that sort of like, I'm free, I get to do what I want, and no, not really. And your enjoyment should never come at the expense of another human being's. And that's just something that you should probably keep in mind. Is the fun that you are about to have going to come at a cost for someone else? Well,
and I think some of that comes from cultural norms, but it also comes from, I think, some misperceptions about cosplayers. I think some people look at cosplayers, particularly women, and think, well, they're doing this for attention. They're doing this because they want people to look at them. I think it's better to assume that they're doing it for themselves. You know, not everything is about you. But really, you know, most of the women I know who cosplay do it because they love it and they're passionate about it. And treating them like that's not true, like their passion's not authentic, like it's only for attention, is really insulting. So if you dig down in that assumption, like, I think there's something wrong there if you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the cosplay thing, I don't cosplay all that much, but I find no real fundamental difference in someone who takes some time to put together an outfit, to, you know, stand in front of the mirror, make sure that things are right, it doesn't look right, go back, rework it, put it on, and go out in it because it feels good in it, and you feel good wearing it. That's no different from me deciding that this shade of shirt worked well with this corduroy jacket that I got.
It does, it's very nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're looking good.
Thank you very much. I got it at the Goodwill, and I was like, I'm proud of this purchase, you know. And then there's absolutely no difference between Where's Waldo's and what I'm rocking right now for me, fundamentally. So don't assume that someone has decided to be a prop for your enjoyment, basically, is what I'm getting at.
I was really surprised. I had never cosplayed at a convention until a couple years ago, and I dressed up as a gender swap doctor with a group of people, and I was stunned at how many very creepy dudes would come up and be like, oh, I'm taking pictures of you guys for my website. If you give me your email, I'll send it to you. You can use them as modeling photos. I'm like, why are you why do you think we even care about modeling? Like, what? And no, I'm not giving you my personal email so you can harass me digitally too.
Well, that was like a tiramisu of creepy.
Yeah.
There were things going on there.
I want to jump onto that really to what Laura said really quickly, and say also that there's absolutely nothing wrong with dressing in a costume because you want attention. Like, that's a valid, I think we tend to say, well, you know, they're not necessarily doing that, don't assume that, but I'd like to see a paradigm. I mean, I feel like there's really dressing in something deliberately to attract attention and to look attractive isn't evil, and doesn't mean that you are inviting or requesting boundary violations. Like, that's an entirely valid reason to do that. Like, an argument that I see come up a lot that I think kind of misses the point is people saying, well, you know, they're just doing it so that guys will pay attention to them, because it's almost always focused on female cosplayers. And then someone else being like, no, they're not, they're never doing that. And I feel like there's a third point, it's like, well, so?
No, I think that's a really good point. You know, I mean, I think it's fair to say in neither situation is it okay to treat someone like a commodity and less than a person. And that there's not necessarily one default reason why people cosplay, and that there's really not one default person why anyone does anything.
Yeah, unless you're like actively defrauding people, you know, I again, what Bobby said, is my enjoyment of this infringing on someone else's safety and comfort and boundaries? And if it's not, yeah, rock, have fun.
And always ask.
Yes.
Always ask.
Well, a question I want to ask is then when we get to the point where the peanut butter parfait of nastiness that like approach it, how do you check that? Because there are ways where you can check that or call attention to it that will automatically blow up into some sort of conflagration, which is, you know, problematic in quite a few ways. A lot of people will just sort of say, okay, I'll just let it go. I'll just let it go, mostly because they don't want to have like a 10 to 15 minute either discussion and or fight that could end up in a scene. So they just sort of subsume it all, just suck it in. But more and more, we're realizing that in order for everyone to increase their enjoyment, in order for everyone to have more fun, because that's what happens when people aren't being awful to each other, in order to have more fun, you have to start checking people. You have to start calling people out, but you can't just hit them over the head with a 2x4 in most cases. How best do you check people who are making mistakes, even if they don't realize they're making mistakes? How do you do that?
I mean, the first thing I'd say is that, you know, you have certainly fundamentally a right to do what makes you feel safe. You are not required to confront anyone, particularly in any way that you think would make you unsafe or provoke a response towards you that could be violent or upsetting.
Ideally, the onus should not be on you to alter your behavior to respond to harassment, but the given that, you know, not an ideal world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you know, I think a lot of it depends on people's comfort. You can always walk away. Like, you don't owe anybody, especially some random jerk who's like taking pictures of you being creepy, like, you don't owe them your time. You can walk away at any time. And sometimes that might be the best situation. I think there are other times when people do want to say something. And there have been times when I felt less comfortable, like when I was younger and when I hadn't talked about this issue as much. In a way, it's something that I had to practice. And like, that's honestly not a crazy thing to do. You know, like if you've ever practiced like a phone call you're going to have to someone you're not sure about, you know, how to talk to them. A lot of us have done that. I mean, it's okay to practice in your head, what would I say if this happened? What would I do if I were in this situation? Who would I talk to? Like, having a plan isn't a bad idea. You know, and in general, or what friend would I call? Like, what would I do? What are my resources in this situation? Even having verbal resources, I think, can be really helpful.
Practice aloud. Practice actually saying the things that you'd want to say. Because in the moment, I think most of us, when we end up in a situation where we're being harassed or come face to face with something, like, it's not something that we're expecting. And it's something that can trigger a really strong and immediate fight or flight response, which makes it really, really hard to then articulate things and act in you know, a cogent and rational and productive way and do what you want. And having those, you know, having those things queued up so that all you have to do is push the mental button makes it a lot easier.
And forgive yourself too. Like,
Yeah.
if you don't do it perfectly, if it doesn't turn out right, you know, I think a lot of people want to engage in these situations, or they ask me, you know, what should I do? It's really hard to know without reading the situation. And like, honestly, if you're dealing with someone harassing you, or if you're trying to help someone else who's being harassed, like, there's a good chance that that's not going to have like a satisfying, the good guys win ending. And like, it's true, and just know that, you know, which sucks, and no one should have to deal with it. But if you don't deal with it in the perfect way, like, I can't remember, was it you that talked to me once about like having your phone stolen? And like how shocking that was to you? I had a friend who was telling me about they got their iPhone stolen. In their mind, they'd always thought to themselves, if someone did this, I'd do
Oh, wait,
that.
no, that was me.
Oh, that was you, know.
Sorry,
And
I'm sorry.
it was you.
I'm like, no. Oh, yeah.
And you think that. You're
Yeah.
like, yeah, and I've like practiced in my mind, I'll run after them and I'll do this. But when it happens, you're actually so in shock that you don't know what to do. And that's happened to me when I've been harassed, where like I had a narrative that I would do this, but it didn't turn out that way.
Right.
And like, that's okay. You know, like, it's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to a lot of other people. Like, forgive yourself. It shouldn't have happened to begin with. You're also not required to have the perfect response.
In those moments, that kind of balances the onus being on the people, the harassers, to not be harassing, and in forgiving, not knowing how to deal with things in the moment. What are some things that you can do after that moment has passed, if it's been blundered, to start trying to change how things are dealt with in a constructive way? So if you're at a con, you've been harassed, you know, I know that Emerald City has a great harassment policy to act on, you know, so here, there's a clear path, but in a murkier con, some how to get help, how to straighten things out, how to improve things for the future.
Can I reframe this a little bit so that it's less about, you know, what to do if you've been harassed and a larger what to do if you are concerned about harassment that is occurring at a specific event? Because there have been a lot of things and questions about bystander resources, and I again really want to make sure that we're not, that this isn't a here's, you know, that this isn't a lot of mandates to people who are subject to harassment. The first thing that I would say if you've been harassed or if you see someone harassed is make sure everyone involved is physically safe. Say, are you okay? Do you need anything? Do you need me to call someone? Or if you've been harassed or attacked, check in with yourself and figure out what you need to do or where you need to go to feel safe enough to then sit down and think about what you want to do next. There are a lot of exhibitors, there are a lot of artists, there are a lot of people who will let you, if you're in a situation where you feel unsafe, going up to someone who's in a position to help you, who works at the con, or even who's just at a table, and saying, can I come stand behind your table for a second? Something scary, really unsettling just happened to me and I need to collect my thoughts. Like, ask that. It's okay to ask those things.
And being able to be a good support to friends who have been harassed.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, knowing what the resources are, it's cool that they're spelled out here. Like, that's not just good for you, that's good for anyone you know. I mean,
Yes.
if someone's been harassed too, if you can, try to make it feel like they're okay. Like, I remember talking to people and seeing like that look of panic in their eyes where they were like, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to help you. Which I understand, but at the same time, if you can have a better sense of what to do and where to go and how to offer them the space that they need and the options that they need, like, that makes you a good resource that can be really helpful and help sort of diffuse that sense of, like, no, it's fine, no, it's okay. You know, I don't want to impose on the part of the person who's been harassed.
If you are ever exhibiting at a show, or even if you're just walking around at a show, this is a new thing at this convention, and I'm really excited about it. An artist named Mott Crook, who's got years of experience in her background as an assault and abuse educator, made a resource guide that's really small. It's a one-page PDF. It's printable, and it's customizable for specific cities and specific conventions. So this one is for Emerald City, but if you exhibit or attend another convention, you can download it and you can customize it for that show or talk to her about doing that. And it's a really pocket guide to, you know, the chapters are something happened, but I don't know if it was abuse or harassment. It's got really brief guides to stuff like relationship abuse and sexual assault, because sometimes those things and stalking, because sometimes those things overlap at conventions. And it's got a guide. It's got a really brief list of local resources and hotlines. And I know the ones in here have been better, that she actually coordinated with local shelters and resources. But I'm really fond of stuff like this, because when you're in a situation where you feel unsafe or where you're not quite sure how to respond to something, having information in a small, easily digestible, and private format can be really helpful. There's, like Laura mentioned, there can be a lot of shame, that you're, like, sort of instinctual response of shame or embarrassment that goes with being harassed. And having something that you can pick up and look at and navigate yourself, either by yourself or with someone, can be really helpful. I don't know the URL off the top of my head, but Mott is at table 301. And she's got more of these. She can tell you at more length, and she's got cards with her website on them.
So I know we've talked about normalization of harassment and being able to identify it. And for people who are perpetrating, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not, I know in situations like cons that sometimes ignorant things are said during panels, and sometimes
I want to address this because,
this might have been a
well, yeah. This one's for me, and I'm just going to spike it. So I was at a game developers conference recently down in San Francisco, which it was my first time there, and it was super amazing. They have like a whole advocacy track devoted to issues of diversity, and I had an amazing time. But there was a question on one of the panels, and so a person in the audience had come up to ask the panel a question, and he ended up using really sexist language, I think unknowingly, in that question. And the coolest thing was, like, the whole room reacted. They were like, oh. And the look on his face, he was immediately like, oh, I have effed up. And he ended up apologizing, and I thought that was such a powerful exercise of different norms, because you can imagine how there would be spaces, there would be conventions where that would have just slid right by, you know, maybe a nervous laugh or something like that. But there was a prevailing sense in that room that what had just been said was completely out of bounds. And that's what shifting norms is kind of about, is trying to create that kind of environment where anyone who behaved that way would immediately be met with, like, the WTF stare, or the, like, what, you know what I mean? Like, that's the kind of reaction that I want to see to harassment and to that type of sexism in these sorts of issues.
That comes down to the voices of people in authority a lot too. And I'm gonna briefly embarrass Bobby, because Bobby's one of the hosts of the Geek Trivia in Portland, which is awesome, and you should all go to it if you're in town. It's really good. And one of the first times I went, he and Court, who's the other host, were reading through team names, and a lot of them are really irreverent, and a lot of them are pretty obscene. And they came to one that was a rape joke and didn't read it aloud and disqualified the team. And it was really awesome. It was the coolest moment, because it wasn't a big deal, but hearing from the people at the mic and the people who set the tone of the event, and the people who write the questions, that yeah, this is a line, makes it a lot more real. And it was really cool.
And it doesn't just have an impact, you know, on the people who are behaving badly. It has an impact, like, on the people who are being supported. Because, like, when that happened in that panel, I felt supported. I was like, oh, I feel like, at least in this room right now, this is a space where, like, it's not okay to talk about me that way. It's not okay to talk about women that way. And, like, that sort of exercise, I think, is really powerful to, you know, the people you're trying to support as well.
Mm-hmm.
For those people, because we're talking about onus of, I don't know what word to, the harassers, that seems. For learning in this changing cultural landscape, because comic books have been this is me tiptoeing a little bit.
Brofest.
A brofest, I like that, for quite a while. For people who are open to change, but are just ignorant, you know, having understanding for that, and what are some resources and ways that they can learn more? I know this seems like an obvious question, but for people who aren't as experienced in this realm as the panel is, kind of, what are some ways they can reach out, and who?
You mean educating themselves personally, or educating other people? Okay.
Educating themselves personally, like learning and growing. Is it as simple as just opening ears and trying to be aware, or is there some way?
There's definitely an element. There's definitely an element of self-awareness in it, because a lot of people don't like to believe that at any point they could be construed as the bad guy.
Yeah.
And that is where a lot of the initial pushback comes from, because we're trying to sort of change the atmosphere so that people do realize when someone comes up to the microphone to ask a question, and they ask it terribly, using, you know, really demeaning language, that just, it doesn't even occur to them that it's demeaning. It's just, this is how I talk. The words, they haven't realized that words mean things, that they have a weight to them. And we're trying to change that atmosphere, so what happens at the panel Laura was at happens more frequently. But they feel bad, and their initial reaction is to go, well, you know, and come up with other examples of someone else doing it, and it's no big deal.
Or doing something, or someone else did something worse, and at least I didn't do that.
Exactly.
Hey, I have female friends.
Yeah, exactly. Or that one, along those lines.
But I mean,
I think it's a matter of realizing that you can make a mistake. We've all made mistakes. I used to be that dumb, thoughtless moron who, you know, used language that he heard without really thinking about what the word meant and what the weight of the word was. And it's sort of a slow motion uphill fight. It's not going to be like an instant victory, like Laura said. You're not going to have too many instances where you get to go to a bar, hang out with your friends, and tell them about the time you were basically, you know, a social advocacy Rocky, and you ran up the steps like, yeah! That's not going to happen. A lot of the time, it's just going to be this slow sort of quiet push towards getting people to think a little bit more about what they're going to say and how they're going to act, and realize that changing that behavior isn't going to change who they, I mean, it's not going to diminish the fun that they're going to have. Because the initial pushback is, oh, well, now it's not going to be as fun if I don't get to say the horrible thing I want to say. It's not going to be as fun. No, it's going to be probably more fun, because now you're not pushing half of the population away from you like a Heisman Trophy.
Well, right, and I don't think most fun is like predicated on taking away fun from other people. But
Yeah.
I just quickly want to note that, like, I personally think it's important to not see sexism as a binary. It's not like there's a group of people who are like never sexist and then people who are totally sexist.
And all of them have Snidely Whiplash mustaches.
Yeah, or they're like, you've mentioned this before. I think that I have said and done things that were sexist in the past, and that's because we live in a culture that is sexist, and that infuses a lot of how we think, and it infuses a lot of what we do, and that doesn't make me or you history's greatest villain, but it does
Speak
mean
for
that
yourself.
we have. What's that?
Yeah, speak for yourself.
All right.
I have aspirations.
This is my lived experience, but it does mean you have to be aware of it, and like if you realize that you've done something sexist, like, I mean, it's not okay, but realize that that's just something that you need to think about and work on and be conscious about, that we all do.
Are you guys familiar with a guy named Jay Smooth? He vlogs as Ill Doctrine.
He's the best.
He has this video that I think should be just like required watching for every human who interacts with other humans, called How to Tell Somebody They Sound Racist. And it's about a lot of the stuff that Bobby mentioned, is sort of the knee-jerk reaction and the difference between and being told what you said was really racist and hearing you're a racist. And it's great for.
Sorry about that pass.
Yeah, we're talking about you.
We are
We are actually
find out
talking
at the
about you,
end,
but
don't worry.
it's, yeah.
It was a contest to see who could draw the best Ewok.
It was actually just an I like you, do you like me note.
Yes.
Inappropriate time.
But where, oh God, I just totally lost that. Right, how to tell somebody they sound racist. But it does a great job from either end. I think it's something that's great to listen to if you're someone who's been called out for stuff too, but of deconstructing, separating a person's identity from their maybe problematic behavior. And I think it's also a really good lesson in how to listen and respond when someone tells you that you've said something racist or sexist, or you've behaved in a way that made them uncomfortable.
Well, I think a lot of harassers come from such a place of privilege where they feel like they have a right to other people's bodies or to make comments. And I think for everyone, it's an evolution of, checking your own privilege and realizing your own assumptions about who you are and who other people are, and learning to be a better human. And once you start that evolution, it's actually kind of hard to stop it, I think. So I think for people who inadvertently make those statements, if they're called out on it, it kind of starts them down a road, hopefully, if they're, a decent person, to learn like, oh, this thing I said was inappropriate. What are other things I'm saying that are inappropriate or offensive? Or, maybe I shouldn't brush by people creepily at a con because people don't like that.
And this may be a separate point from what we were talking about, but I'm just going to say it anyway because I wanted to say it, is that, because I feel like I've had a lot of guys ask me, like, what can I do? I've read the articles about harassment. I realize it's a problem. Like, what do I do now? And there are a lot of answers to that. But one thing that I've been thinking often is important is that I'd love to see more men talking to other men.
Yes.
Especially in, strongly masculine cultures. Like, I can talk to men, but, like, men also need to be talking to each other, especially when you're talking about it in the context of masculinity. That's something that men define amongst themselves. And that doesn't mean that you need to use the language that we use. I mean, you may be the best gauge of your friends and the words that you're going to say and how they were going to hear them. But I think starting those conversations is important, and hearing it from other men. I mean, you can probably speak to this better than I can, but that's important.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily easy, because Lord knows one of the phrases I've come to despise is the term white knight. And if you are a guy who is trying to get your guy friends to maybe not be so liberal with their sexist or homophobic terminology, because it's a bummer to hang out with people who are just throwing that around and being really exclusionary. If you're going to try and sort of, I guess, course correct them, or get them to maybe hopefully course correct themselves so they realize they're being a bummer and you probably don't want to hang out with them so much if that's going to continuing, you're going to have phrases like white knight thrown at you. You're going to have your masculinity questioned. And so what? Let them question. There are degrees of confidence at play here, and at play in any sort of social situation, and you have got to put in the work to sort of realize, I guess, that the course you're taking is the correct one. And once you have some sort of faith in that, once you sort of like, look, I'm trying to make it so everyone can have as much fun doing the things I like to do as I do, which is essentially like, for me, that's the core. When I come to a comic book convention, I'm here to have fun, and I want to have as much fun as possible, and I don't want half the room to not be able to just have that opportunity closed off to them simply because they're not a guy. Like, that seems really unfair and horrible to me. And talking to other guys about that, it's a bit of a struggle, because it's like you said, the binary thing. They're just sort of convinced that if someone else is having fun, that their fun is being taken away. Like, there's a subtraction going on.
Zero-sum fun.
Yeah, it's zero-sum fun. And it's silly, it's ridiculous. That's not actually the case. You will not have less fun. It's not like there's a core pool of fun that is now being divvied up and you're getting less of it. But that's the initial response, and it's a matter of just sort of, as myself being someone who's helping advocate for it, realizing that's absolutely not the case. That's a silly, conception. And B, just trying to figure out a way to get people to sort of acclimate to that idea.
And also, to whatever degree it's helpful to, deconstruct that notion of white knight, because I think there's something really, really depressing in it.
Yeah.
Like, on behalf of men, I'll speak for men, this notion that men couldn't be interested in the welfare of women without wanting something from them sexually. And I think that that's such a depressing and completely untrue idea, and not how I think about men at all, and not how, in my humble opinion, men should think about themselves. And at least understanding that that's what's going on in there.
Well, I think it once again diminishes women to something sexual, which is ridiculous, because it's like, no, we're not just sex objects where the only reason a man would want to defend another human is because of sex. Like, that's completely ridiculous.
I think in geek culture specifically, something else that needs to come concurrent with that is to really, really look at at our default assumptions as far as gender and default populations in our community, because there's an overwhelming sense, and less here and less now than even a few years ago, that when I say geek, there's a male in parentheses next to it. There isn't a geek guy con, there's a geek girl con. Like, that's where it gets qualified. And because of that tacit assumption, I think in communities and conventions and industries, definitely, there's a sense that women are perennially other, and they're interlopers. And I think that's also true. That's true of people of color. That's true of queer people. It's true of anyone who doesn't fit a fairly specific mold. And we talked a lot about not reducing people to objects and humanizing them. And I think what that's going to take ultimately in terms of culture shift is broadening the definition of what counts as a person in those settings. It's not just going to be saying let's look at all these specific individuals. It's going to be saying, so I went to the Carol Corps meetup on Thursday night. Was anyone else there? It was so good. Oh my God, I'd never been to one, and I was writing about it, which is why I ended up there, and it blew my mind, because it was a predominantly female group. There were a lot of dudes, and every single person I talked to talked about how much they liked it, because it was a bunch of people who were all there because they were really excited about something, and they wanted to share it with other people who were really excited about, and introduce other people to it. And like, people were really proud of being like, yeah, and my friend like never read comics, and or coming in and be like, yeah, I had never read comics, and I started reading this one, and it was so great, and now I have this pull list. But like, who were proud of their investment and enthusiasm and not like a checklist of what they'd done, and it completely changed the social dynamic there. And it was, I think, the first time I've been at a geek event where there was no implicit sense that there was something to prove, and especially that there wasn't an implicit sense that there was something to prove drawn down gender lines. And seeing that in a room with 250 people at a sold-out event makes me a lot more optimistic about that kind of shift on a larger scale. So, more of that. Watch what they're doing, do that stuff.
We're running out of time, but we would like to take a few questions. The mic's over here in the corner if anyone would like to partake of that. First person there, feel free to go ahead.
Hi. I had a question about the first thing that you guys talked about, the idea that you set a threshold and you can't go back and revise that threshold. That, well, I didn't complain when they did X, so how can I possibly justify complaining when they do X plus Y on top of it? What would you say to get people to reorganize their thoughts and change that way of thinking so that they can forgive themselves and start making changes to the way that they respond the next time, or the way that they expect people to respond the next time?
I mean, I think it's tough because sometimes that can mean retroactively acknowledging harm, right? So if you're in your mind, you were like, well, it wasn't a big deal. You know, it can be tough, I think, to go back and be like, well, actually it was. And now I have to absorb that. Like, I have to absorb the impact of that in a real way. I don't know, do you have any specific?
I think that nails a lot of why it's difficult. What I would look at is, I mean, what we count as normal is defined in large part by what we can survive. There are, if you look at and read, and I'm sure that there are folks in the room or people who know folks who've grown up under really difficult or abusive circumstances, and the things you deal with every day define your normal, and a big part of getting out of those circumstances is learning to redefine that normal, to be able to say, this was a thing that happened regularly, but that doesn't make it an okay thing. And that's a process that goes on the other side too. Like Laura mentioned about harassers, your definitions change, and that's part of being a person. Like, you have to be able and willing to reevaluate your assumptions and your expectations for yourself and other people as you learn. And that applies not just to things you do, but to things that you've experienced.
And
Well, sorry.
well, also, I think you need to forgive yourself and admit that it doesn't matter the scope of what's happening. If it makes you uncomfortable, it makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And you have the right to say, I don't care that this was just a comment or a brush by or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
When things are worse, things are always worse. Like,
Yeah.
you can always find a worse situation, but that doesn't mean it wasn't uncomfortable for you and it didn't make you feel bad.
Yeah, there's no hierarchy of abusive behavior where, like, there's the stuff that really counts, and there's the stuff that's just a little creepy. And there's a term that you can find online if you haven't heard it, microaggressions, which are just, those are the small, pervasive isms that just seep in around the edges and inform things and approaches, and those eat away. Like, the fact that they have impact is enough to make them worth addressing.
Well, and that's why so many corporate sexual harassment policies cover hostile work environment, because it's not just about one incident, it's about if you feel uncomfortable in that environment.
And pervasive patterns, yeah.
And I mean, there's a reason that there's terminology around, like, victims versus survivors, right? Like, you don't have to see yourself as just a victim. You're also someone who, like, got through that situation, like, however you did it. You know, not you, but one. And that is one way to frame it in your mind.
It's also okay to look at the fact that different events have different things have different weight. Like, one of the things when I was working at a crisis center that came up a lot is that there's really no right way to be a victim, and there are people who have, like, the same thing can have really different impact on different people or on the same person at different times, and that's okay. That doesn't make it less real, and that doesn't make anyone's reaction less valid. So I guess giving yourself space to change, giving yourself space to acknowledge the ways you've changed, and to be able to retroactively apply that. And honestly, this is something that I kind of had to explicitly hear a few times before it really sunk in. Women learn really early that getting mad is a really bad thing to do, and that you can be like kind of bitchy, but you can't, like, just being like, this is crappy, this should not have happened, and being really angry about it. Like, you're allowed to do that. This is you don't need it from me, but like, this is permission. It's yeah.
Thank you.
I don't have so much a question as a comment. I wanted to recommend an article that I read called Schrodinger's Rapist, which was, have you guys read that?
Yeah.
And it kind of inverted the idea of the victim of a sexual assault. We say about 1 in 6 women in the United States has been assaulted, but if you inverse that and you get the idea that maybe a person who is raped once will rape 10 times, that's 1 in 60 men, roughly. So how many would be in your graduating class, or how many would you work with, or how many would be your Facebook friends? And that, I think, really got to the guys who read that, who said, okay, this isn't just about the victims, this is actually a pattern of behavior that men have displayed.
Yes.
So I thought that guys who couldn't get to it from that, from the usual way, could use that as a resource.
It's a great article, and if it's the one I'm thinking of, it also mentions something that really hit me that I didn't think of, which is that about rape jokes specifically, and the fact that if you're telling one and laughing at one in a group of people you don't know super well, it's possible that there's someone who's a rape survivor there who's hearing you laugh at a really awful experience. But B, it's also possible that there's someone there who you're telling that rape is funny and it's kind of a joke and it's cool, it's funny, it's not a big deal, who is a potential assailant.
Or already a rapist, who thinks, oh, hey, he's on my side.
Well,
awesome.
It's funny, I read this article that was sort of responding to this idea where it's like, feminists think all men are rapists. And it was like, actually, you know who thinks that most men are rapists? Rapists.
Yeah.
Like, they look around and they think that their behavior is, like, totally normal. And anything that feeds into that culture, if you want to talk about changing that norm, like, that is so key. That is so key. And again, like, men talking to each other, like, that is something that men should not think that most other men are rapists.
Yeah, vocally establish that norm, vocally establish that line.
We've just got a couple minutes left,
Okay.
so let's see if we can get through these last 2 questions.
Okay, hi. How do we have conversations with kind of the shapers of the geek community, various industries? Because we know that a lot of the medium itself and the people that are involved in it kind of perpetuate the culture of sexism and harassment, those kinds of things. So how do we kind of open up dialogues or even hold accountable artists who maybe totally objectify women, or writers who write really bad stereotypes of certain races or genders? How do we kind of reach above just the average con goer that says something, sexist or asshole-ish?
Oh my God, I want there to be a whole another hour-long panel.
Yeah.
I know, it's a bigger question.
You talk about it a lot. You find advocates who have platforms and who will share those platforms. Find people who are writing and making and editing comics who are coming from a similar angle. Draw those things to their attention, or write about them yourself. Laura and Janelle and I are all journalists who've covered harassment issues really extensively online, and at this point people come to us with stories,
Which is always welcome, but often very depressing.
Yeah, it can be intense, but it's also really good. And like, that's how there was a woman earlier this year who was harassed really just incredibly explicitly by a games journalist.
Oh yeah.
And because of that, and because of that reputation, like, I ended up being able to interview her for Kotaku. So look for the people who are calling those things out and have platforms, because we all talk, we all network, and we all know we all know people at publishers who are friendly. We all know people who are in the industry who are friendly. Keep building those communities and networks and make yourself visible as someone who wants to talk about them, and they will find you.
Well, also, I mean, this is kind of a basic thing, but vote with your dollars.
Yeah.
I mean, support the books and the creators and the publishers who are not producing sexist, disgusting drivel. And hopefully there will be more not sexist, disgusting drivel out there.
Write letters.
Write letters.
Yes, for real.
You know, tweet.
Those get read.
And I just want to note that article that you wrote on Kotaku about that woman, that came up at GDC.
Really?
Like, it was, on a couple of the panels, there was one where Brenda Romero got up and projected it and gave a fire on the mountain rant about it. And I was like, yes. You know, and that was important, you know. That was important, and it ended up, like, if you have the chance to boost a signal about this, boost it. Like, if you have a voice, if you have a platform, use it. Even if, like, your platform and your voice, you don't feel like it's huge, you know, like, use it when you can.
Oh,
Do
and
what you
give
can.
props to people who are talking about stuff. So Oni Press made penalty cards this year. These are based loosely on something someone made at DEF CON, and they're pretty funny. They've got yellow cards, which are, my favorite is, this is a comic convention, not the internet. Your whole deal is bumming me the hell out, and the red cards, hit the bricks, chump, and find a booth that sells manners, you wad. So,
We have a ton available down
yeah.
here.
And I'll stick some over here. They gave us a bunch to bring. And I was really excited because Oni's not a huge publisher, but they're big and they're visible. And voting with your dollars goes both ways. So, like, going up there and finding John Shork and telling him, I'm so glad you did this. This is awesome. And calling out the people who are doing things right really vocally is going to encourage them to keep doing that, because, yeah.
It's funny, like, I had a friend say to me a friend of mine saw, like, an article online someone had written, and he's like, I'm going to send her a letter and let her know, like, how important her work is. And I was like, oh, that's nice. And he's like, everybody thinks that, like, other people are saying it, you know? But,
Yeah.
like, honestly, letting those people know, especially if you're doing this type of work, you probably get a lot of crap. You probably get a lot of harassment yourself for talking about harassment. Hearing those people say, hey, that meant a lot to me for you to do that. Like, I'm so glad that you're talking about these things. Like, that's important, and that supports people.
I save all those emails to read on
See, and I
Thursdays.
treasure them, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's a
Yeah.
real thing.
Let's get to our last
Okay.
question.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know if you can answer this exactly, but what do you say to the males and females who say that you're overreacting, this isn't a problem, and that men and women are in fact equal?
My initial answer to that has always been, there has never been a single societal problem in the history of people that has ever been solved by you sitting on your thumb and just waiting for it to fix itself. That's never happened in the history of anything, and that seems to be the answer that I get thrown back at me when I bring up things, when I link to an article like the one on Kotaku that you wrote, you know, when I, you know, write about something horrible that has happened, you know, on television even, you know, that Comic Book Men show. Like, I covered the hell out of that for the Portland Mercury, and I got a lot of people, you know, pushing back about, you know, why are you making such a big deal about it? Like, if it's that big of a problem, it's going to get fixed. Like, no, it's
there's
not
genocide, Bobby. There's genocide you could be writing about.
Exactly. Why, and you know, that concern trolling type stuff. And it's no, it's not going to get solved unless people start talking about it. Because if you just go, oh, well, that sucks, there's no incentive for anyone to ever attempt addressing it. So, yeah, I guess, you know, it's not going to fix itself. Nothing ever really fixes itself. Someone has to at least put one foot forward, and hopefully more steps will follow to fix the problem that you want fixed.
I mean, I hear that so much that it's kind of like the peanut parent voice, where it's like, but, you know, I try to see it compassionately, right? Because, like, what happens is that there's a system, and a lot of people are invested in the system. And anytime you try to change that system, they're going to, like, dig in their claws and dig in their heels. And they're not
zero-sum
gonna wanna
joy thing.
change.
Yeah, you're taking away my fun.
And, you know, it's any time you try to move outside of a certain box, you know, whether it's like a box as a woman, a box as a man, a box as a geek, anytime you start doing that, there are going to be people who try to police you back into it, just inevitably. And it means you're kind of doing something right. You know, that is the cost of progress. Like, that's how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just another way of silencing people who want to make a positive change, and you can't let them. Just keep shouting.
Last thing, if you something that I've tried to start doing and I need to do more consistently, build an an activism tool bag of links to 101 articles on the topics that are coming up that explain things lucidly, things like that Schrodinger's rapist article. Like start an Evernote file or a Pinterest board, so you can go like, okay, this person went patriarchy's not real. I have one for that. And because there are a lot of resources already, and if you try to personally educate everyone who throws that stuff up, that is a thankless, miserable, full-time, and then some job.
Well, and also,
like, let the people who've done the work continue to have done the work for you.
and also, it's important to build on the work that's already been done.
Yes.
You know, like
Yeah.
a lot of women and men have spent a lot of time writing really amazing articles that just crystallize it in eloquent, amazing ways. So, like, you don't have to start from the beginning. You don't have to. You don't also have to explain to every single person from the beginning every single one of these things. Just send the link.
Yeah, and it's okay to have a line and be like, nope, I'm not educating anyone today. I'm done.
It's
like,
true.
Choose your battles.
And self-care is a real thing. Like, solving harassment is not squarely on your shoulders and your shoulders alone. Like, I think everybody should try to take part in it, but, like, you see people who, like, feel that they have to throw themselves on, like, the hot coals of dealing with, like, every Twitter troll that tweets at them.
Get friends who you know will have your back. Like, I'm shameless about this. Like, if I have a nonstop Twitter troll, I'll just send Chris Sims a link to the thread. Because he can get away with being much, much more of a dick on Twitter than I can for a lot of reasons. But like, find people who will have your back and have other people's backs. Those, like, having people like the people on this panel and other friends is why we're able to keep doing this. Like, this is like, if you were an island, you will sink really fast. Like, all of that longevity comes from that community and comes from mutual support.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for our panelists.
And thank you again, Emerald City, for rocking safe space and harassment resources. Like, this is the best harassment policy I've ever seen, and I used to just have a database of them. So you guys have gone above and beyond, and you're awesome, and I love you.